I wasn't supposed to be there that day. My brother's graduation was a closed event, my name deliberately omitted from the guest list he'd submitted. The rift between us had grown too deep, too permanent. Or so I thought until I heard the dean's voice echo through the auditorium. Please welcome Colonel Hayes. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The rental car's air conditioning struggled against North Carolina's oppressive June heat as I pulled into the university parking lot. After a 6-hour flight from the West Coast and another hour navigating unfamiliar roads, I had finally arrived. My uniform had stayed packed, a deliberate choice. Today wasn't about Colonel Hayes. It was about my brother's graduation. I smoothed down my beige suit jacket, feeling strangely vulnerable without the weight of medals across my chest. Around me, families streamed toward the grand brick buildings, their faces bright with pride and anticipation. Mothers adjusted corsages, fathers checked camera batteries, and younger siblings fidgeted in uncomfortable formal wear. The campus hummed with excitement, a stark contrast to the military precision I'd grown accustomed to over 20 years of service. The quad was transformed into a sea of celebration. Graduates in black robes huddled for photos. Professors in academic regalia strode purposefully between buildings, and proud relatives clutched programs and flower bouquets. I scanned the crowd, finally spotting my family near the central fountain. My mother noticed me first. Her smile tightened at the corners as she gave me a quick, stiff hug. "You made it," she said, her tone suggesting surprise rather than pleasure. My father stood behind her, suddenly fascinated by the program in his hands, avoiding my gaze entirely. "The ceremony starts in 30 minutes," my mother continued, her eyes darting around as if worried someone might recognize me. "We should head inside to find good seats." My brother's wife approached, her critical gaze lingering on my military straight posture. "No uniform today?" she asked with a smirk. "I thought you'd want everyone to know about your important career." "Not today," I replied evenly. "This is his moment." As we walked toward the auditorium, I noticed the distance my father maintained, always keeping someone between us. 20 years of missed birthdays, holidays, and family gatherings had created a gulf wider than any ocean I'd crossed during deployments. Inside the building, the cool air offered relief from the humidity, but not from the tension. Students and families filled the rows of seats, their chatter creating a constant background hum. I followed my family down the aisle, conscious of my mother's nervous glances and my father's determined silence. I took my seat, feeling more like a stranger than family. The program in my hands listed my brother's name among the graduates, his achievements highlighted, in bold text. I smiled despite the knot in my stomach. Whatever distance had grown between us, I was genuinely proud of him. I approached the entrance to the auditorium with measured steps, the confidence I'd carried through 20 years of military service suddenly wavering. The usher, a young man with a pressed blue uniform and a clipboard, greeted me with a perfunctory smile. I gave him my name, expecting the quick nod that would grant me passage to my brother's graduation ceremony. "Colonel Hayes," he confirmed, running his finger down the list. His eyes scanned the page once, then twice. The pause stretched uncomfortably long. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You're not on here." My heart hammered against my ribcage as the words registered. Not on the list. The clipboard might as well have been a barrier wall. I had flown across the country, rented a car, and driven hours to be here, only to be erased from this milestone moment. "There must be some mistake," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm the graduate sister." The usher's expression shifted to apologetic discomfort. "I can only admit those on the approved list, ma'am." University policy. I spotted my mother approaching, her floral dress and pearls perfectly selected for the occasion. Relief washed over me. Surely she would clarify this misunderstanding. Instead, she barely met my eyes as she brushed past. "Let's not make a scene," she whispered, her fingers briefly touching my arm. "Today is about your brother, not you." The sting of her words left me momentarily speechless. My father followed close behind, his gaze fixed somewhere over my shoulder. "Just keeping things simple," he mumbled, hands thrust deep in his pockets. "Limited seating and all that." They disappeared through the heavy oak doors, leaving me stranded in the hallway. The sister-in-law glanced back with what looked suspiciously like satisfaction before the doors swung shut behind her. The sound was definitive, a physical barrier between me and my family's celebration. Through the thick wood, I could hear the muffled sounds of the ceremony beginning, the swelling notes of the marching band, the polite applause, the drone of the dean's welcome speech, all the familiar sounds of academic pageantry that I would experience only as an outsider. I stood there, alone in the empty hallway, my beige suit suddenly feeling like the wrong uniform for this particular battlefield. The discipline that had carried me through war zones couldn't prepare me for this particular type of exclusion, the kind that came from your own blood. The clipboard-wielding usher avoided my eyes, busying himself with paperwork. I squared my shoulders out of habit, a colonel with nowhere to march, no troops to lead, and apparently no place in her own family's proudest moment. The stone steps felt cool against my legs as I sat outside the auditorium, alone with my thoughts and the oppressive North Carolina humidity. Each breath was an effort in the thick air that clung to my skin like an unwelcome embrace. My heels tapped in anxious rhythm against the weathered stone, a military habit of keeping time when nerves threatened to overtake discipline. From inside came another round of applause, the muffled sound piercing through the heavy oak doors and striking me with fresh waves of humiliation. 20 years of army service, of leading troops through impossible situations, of making split-second decisions that saved lives. All of it seemed to evaporate in the face of my own family's rejection. Colonel Hayes, respected by generals and feared by enemies, rendered invisible by her own blood. My smartphone vibrated in my purse. I pulled out the device and glanced at the screen. A text from my cousin. "Are you coming in or what?" I slipped the phone back without responding, my throat tight with emotion I refused to acknowledge. The digital clock on my device reminded me of all I'd missed over the years. Birthdays marked only by hurried video calls from overseas bases, Christmases spent in desert outposts rather than around the family tree. My father's retirement dinner attended via a grainy video connection that kept freezing at crucial moments. All those sacrifices made in service to my country now seemed to count for nothing in the ledger of family belonging. The irony wasn't lost on me. I could command respect from hundreds of soldiers, but couldn't secure a place at my own brother's graduation. A family emerged from the building, their faces bright with pride, arms linked in celebration. The father caught my eye, noticing my formal attire and straight posture. For a moment, recognition flickered across his face, the kind reserved for those who serve, before his wife pulled him along toward the parking area. I considered leaving, driving the rental car back to my hotel and catching the next flight out. It would be the easiest path, retreat and regroup as we said in the Army. But something kept me rooted to those steps, a stubborn refusal to surrender this ground without a fight. Another wave of applause rolled through the doors. I straightened my spine, muscle memory from years of standing at attention taking over. Whatever happened next, I would face it with the same resolve that had carried me through 2 decades of service, even if the battlefield was now my own family's acceptance. I watched as my mother swept past me for the third time, her eyes deliberately fixed on some invisible point beyond my shoulder. She clutched her designer purse like a shield, herding a group of distant relatives toward the reception area. Not one of them acknowledged me sitting alone on the stone steps. The humidity made my beige suit cling uncomfortably to my skin. a sensation eerily reminiscent of desert deployments, though the battlefield had never felt this isolating. Looks like the colonel couldn't command her way into this ceremony, my sister-in-law stage whispered to my cousin, loud enough for me to hear. Her perfectly manicured hand covered her mouth in mock discretion, but the smirk in her eyes was unmistakable. A barely disguised laugh followed, echoing against the auditorium's closed doors. I straightened my spine instinctively, the way I had done countless times before addressing my troops. 20 years of military service had taught me how to maintain composure under fire, but nothing had prepared me for becoming the family joke. My smartphone vibrated again, another message I couldn't bring myself to read. Through the heavy oak doors, I could hear the muffled sounds of the ceremony continuing without me. Each round of applause felt like a personal rejection. The dean's voice occasionally boomed through, praising academic excellence and future potential, all the things my family apparently believed military service couldn't match. A group of professors walked past, their academic regalia fluttering in the humid Carolina breeze. They glanced at me with curiosity, perhaps wondering why someone in formal attire sat excluded from the celebration inside. I nodded politely, the gesture automatic after years of protocol. The truth crystallized with painful clarity. My achievements, the promotions, the medals, the lives saved, meant nothing here. In this academic sanctuary, my military career was an inconvenient footnote in the family narrative, something to be minimized rather than celebrated. My brother's graduation was to be unmarred by any reminder of service or sacrifice. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the same discipline that had carried me through firefights and impossible missions. It would have been easy to demand entrance, to pull rank as I had done countless times before. Yet something deeper held me back. Perhaps pride, perhaps the stubborn hope that my family would eventually see me as more than just my uniform. So I remained seated, back straight, eyes forward, refusing to beg for the inclusion that should have been freely given. The discipline that had defined my career now became my armor against humiliation. The sudden silence hit me like a physical force. One moment, the graduation ceremony hummed with the predictable cadence of names being called, polite applause following each. The next, complete stillness. I straightened my back against the stone steps, a reflex from 20 years of military discipline. Then the dean's voice boomed through the speakers mounted outside the auditorium, clear and commanding. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a distinguished guest with us today. Please welcome Colonel Hayes, who has served our country with distinction for 2 decades. My heart stopped. Had I misheard? The heavy oak doors of the auditorium swung open, and a young usher, the same one who had turned me away minutes earlier, stood there looking flustered. "Ma'am, the dean is asking for you," he stammered, his earlier confidence replaced with uncertainty. Inside the auditorium, I could hear the scraping of chairs against the polished floor as people rose to their feet. A ripple of applause began tentatively, then swelled into something substantial. My palms grew damp against the beige fabric of my suit. I stood, my military training taking over as my mind raced with questions. How did the dean know who I was? Why this sudden acknowledgement when my own family had chosen to exclude me? The usher gestured urgently. "This way, Colonel." My legs carried me forward while my thoughts remained scattered. The cool air conditioning of the auditorium hit my face as I stepped through the threshold. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me, some curious, others admiring, a few confused. The applause continued, growing stronger. I caught sight of my mother's face in the family section, her expression frozen between embarrassment and shock. My father stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. In the front row, my brother's shoulders had tensed visibly beneath his graduation gown. The dean stood at the podium, a tall man with silver hair and a commanding presence that reminded me of my first commanding officer. He gestured toward the stage with an encouraging smile. Each step down the center aisle felt like walking through quicksand. The weight of attention pressed in from all sides. Not the familiar weight of military inspection, but something entirely different. This wasn't about rank or protocol. This was personal. A strange sensation bloomed in my chest. Part vindication, part discomfort, part unexpected pride. For years, I'd compartmentalized my military achievements away from family gatherings, knowing they stirred complicated feelings. Now those worlds were colliding in the most public way possible. As I approached the stage, the dean extended his hand. The applause continued, punctuated by a few enthusiastic whoops from the graduating students. Whatever happened next would change everything. My relationship with my family, my place in this community, and perhaps something deeper within myself. The double doors swung open, and I froze momentarily at the threshold. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me. A sea of unfamiliar faces bathed in the warm glow of the auditorium lights. Students in their black graduation gowns, parents clutching programs, and professors in academic regalia all rose to their feet in unison. The gesture, so unexpected, sent a wave of emotion through me that 20 years of military discipline couldn't suppress. I straightened my spine instinctively, the beige suit suddenly feeling inadequate compared to my dress uniform. The familiar scent of polished wood mingled with the sweet fragrance of graduation flowers and the unmistakable electricity of anticipation. My heels clicked rhythmically against the floor as I walked down the center aisle, each step measured and deliberate, not from military training, but from the surreal nature of the moment. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "That's her, Colonel Hayes," someone murmured to my right. The dean stood at the podium, his smile encouraging as he gestured toward the empty seat they'd prepared on stage. The journey down that aisle felt longer than any march I'd ever undertaken. Halfway to the stage, I caught my brother's eye in the front row of graduates. His expression was thunderous, jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth, eyes narrowed in what could only be described as fury. He hadn't wanted me here. That much was painfully clear. The graduate shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his carefully orchestrated moment now sharing the spotlight. Yet, as the applause continued to swell around us, something shifted in his expression. The hard line of his mouth softened almost imperceptibly. Confusion replaced anger in his eyes, perhaps wondering why these strangers were honoring his sister when he himself had tried to erase me from this day. My parents sat rigid in the family section. Mother stared straight ahead, refusing to meet my gaze, while father's eyes followed me with an unreadable expression. My sister-in-law leaned over to whisper something to a relative, her smirk barely concealed. But for once, their rejection couldn't touch me. The weight of community respect, genuine and unsolicited, pressed against my chest in a way that military medals never had. These people didn't know me, owed me nothing, yet they stood in recognition of service that my own family had dismissed. As I reached the steps to the stage, a strange realization washed over me. This wasn't about protocol or rank. For the first time in my career, I was being seen not just as Colonel Hayes, but as a person worthy of honor, even by those who had no obligation to give it. The ceremony ended with a flurry of tassels and caps tossed skyward. As families converged on graduates with hugs and flowers, I found myself unexpectedly surrounded. A young woman with a press badge approached, notebook already flipped open. "Colonel Hayes, I'm from the Carolina Observer. Would you mind commenting on the dean's recognition of your service today?" Her pen hovered expectantly over the page. Before I could answer, I caught sight of my mother hovering 10 feet away, her lips pressed into a thin line that spoke volumes. She clutched her purse with white knuckles, clearly mortified by the attention I was receiving. My father had positioned himself strategically behind a decorative pillar, hands thrust deep in his pockets, studying the floor tiles as if they contained military secrets. "I'm honored the dean acknowledged my service," I said carefully, aware of every word's potential to become family ammunition later. The military taught me that recognition is always about the team, not the individual. The reporter scribbled furiously, asking follow-up questions about my deployments and leadership philosophy. As we spoke, a small crowd of graduates in their black gowns formed around us. These were my brothers, classmates, young faces bright with admiration and curiosity. "Your speech at the Military Leadership Summit last year changed how I approach team projects," one young man said, extending his hand. "I've quoted you in 3 different papers." Another graduate, a young woman with honors cords draped around her neck, admitted, "I've learned more from your 5 minutes on stage today than from an entire semester of organizational behavior." Their words were genuine, their respect palpable. Each compliment created a strange dissonance, public validation against the backdrop of my family's frigid reception. I could feel my brother's gaze from across the auditorium, his expression unreadable as he watched his peers cluster around me. My smartphone buzzed in my pocket, likely another relative asking where I'd disappeared to. I ignored it, focusing instead on these students who saw value in my journey. The contrast was stark, strangers celebrating what my family seemed determined to diminish. When the reporter finally closed her notebook and thanked me, I caught a glimpse of my sister-in-law whispering to a cluster of ants, her eyes darting in my direction, followed by poorly concealed laughter. The message was clear. I might be Colonel Hayes to the world, but to them, I remained an inconvenient intrusion on their perfect day. The irony wasn't lost on me. After 20 years commanding respect in combat zones, I stood powerless in the face of family politics, caught between public celebration and private rejection. The reception hall buzzed with celebration, champagne flutes clinking against the backdrop of congratulatory chatter. I stood near a table adorned with graduation-themed decorations, nursing a glass of water while scanning the room for familiar faces. That's when I heard her voice, my sister-in-law's unmistakable tone cutting through the ambient noise. "You should have seen her standing there like a statue," she said, mimicking my posture with exaggerated stiffness. "20 years in the army, and she can't even relax at a family event." The small circle of aunts and cousins erupted in laughter. One aunt, my father's sister, glanced in my direction, then quickly looked away when our eyes met. I maintained my composure, the same discipline that had carried me through combat zones now serving as armor against family ridicule. "Did she really force her way in?" asked my cousin Marjorie, leaning in conspiratorially. "I heard the dean personally invited her up." "More like she engineered the whole thing," my sister-in-law replied, rolling her eyes. "Always has to be the center of attention." I moved toward the refreshment table, pretending I hadn't heard, but the damage was already spreading through the reception like spilled wine on white linen. Families from my brother's graduating class whispered behind programs and napkins, their eyes following me across the room. My smartphone vibrated in my pocket. A text from my cousin. "Thomas, are you still at the reception? Everyone's talking about what happened." I slipped outside to the university courtyard, needing air that wasn't thick with gossip. The evening breeze offered temporary relief as I collected my thoughts. My device buzzed again, this time a call from another cousin. "Is it true you weren't invited but showed up anyway?" she asked without preamble. Her voice carried that peculiar mix of admiration for my audacity and suspicion of my motives. The family group chat is blowing up with different versions. "I was invited by the dean," I answered simply, unwilling to feed the drama. "Well, Aunt Margaret says you embarrassed everyone by making it about your military career instead of your brother's big day." The conversation ended shortly after, but the reality settled heavily on my shoulders. In the small North Carolina town, where I'd hoped my years of service would be respected, My reputation was being rewritten by family whispers. The narrative was shifting from decorated colonel to attention-seeking sister, and there seemed little I could do to correct it. Walking back toward the reception, I caught my reflection in a window. Straight-backed, chin high, the posture they mocked was the same one that had earned me respect in places far more dangerous than this. My reputation here might hang in the balance, but I knew who I was, even if my family had forgotten. The reception had thinned out when my brother finally approached me. His graduation cap was tucked under his arm, the tassel swinging nervously as he gestured toward the empty courtyard. His face was flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and something else. Guilt, perhaps. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the distant chatter of remaining guests. We walked in silence until we reached a stone bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. The evening air felt heavy with unspoken words. He sat down, placing his cap beside him, and stared at his hands for what seemed like an eternity. "I asked them not to put you on the guest list," he finally admitted, the words tumbling out in a rush. "It wasn't Mom or Dad's idea. It was mine." The confession hit me like shrapnel, sharp, unexpected, and deeply penetrating. 20 years of military discipline kept my expression neutral, but inside, I felt the sting of betrayal more acutely than any battlefield wound. "I just," he continued, struggling to meet my eyes. "I wanted one day where I wasn't Colonel Hayes's little brother, where people weren't comparing us, asking about you, telling me how proud I must be." His voice cracked slightly. "For once, I wanted to be the one they were proud of." I remained silent, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. The military had taught me to endure physical pain, but nothing in my training had prepared me for this kind of hurt, the kind that comes from family. "I know it was selfish," he said, picking at a loose thread on his graduation gown. "I didn't expect the dean to recognize you. I didn't think about how it would feel for you to be left standing outside." My first instinct was to respond with the cold efficiency I'd used to dress down a subordinate, but something stopped me. Through my pain, I glimpsed his struggle, the shadow I'd unknowingly cast over his achievements, the comparison he could never escape. "I understand wanting your own moment," I finally said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But family doesn't exclude family." He nodded, shame evident in every line of his body. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Really sorry." We sat in silence as twilight descended over the campus. My stubborn pride kept me from offering immediate forgiveness, but beneath my armor of hurt, a flicker of empathy sparked to life. This wasn't a battlefield with clear enemies and allies. This was family, messy and complicated. As we walked back toward the illuminated buildings, I realized that reconciliation, like most important missions, would take time, strategy, and patience. The wound was fresh, but not fatal. 3 weeks after the graduation ceremony, I was sorting through my inbox when an unfamiliar email address caught my attention. The sender was Dean Richards from the university. My finger hovered over the delete button. I'd had enough of North Carolina for a while, but curiosity won out. "Dear Colonel Hayes," the message began, "I hope this finds you well after your visit to our campus." He explained that he had been following my career for some time through military publications and alumni networks. The dean had recognized my name on the graduation program and made the split-second decision to acknowledge my presence. "Your service record is extraordinary," he wrote, "and I believe our students would benefit greatly from hearing your story." In a community where military service was often overlooked in favor of academic achievements, he felt my perspective could bridge an important gap. I read the email twice, feeling a strange mixture of vindication and hesitation. This recognition, from a complete stranger, provided the validation my own family had withheld. The dean's words carried weight that 20 years of medals somehow couldn't convey to my parents or brother. He invited me to return to campus for a leadership forum the following month. Your experience navigating both military hierarchy and family dynamics represents a unique perspective on leadership under pressure, he wrote. The forum would include students, faculty, and community members interested in different models of leadership beyond the classroom. My first instinct was to decline. Returning to the place where I'd felt so invisible seemed masochistic. Yet something in his sincere appreciation made me pause. Perhaps this was an opportunity to transform my humiliation into something meaningful, to rewrite the narrative of that day on my own terms. I found myself drafting a response, accepting his invitation. This wasn't about proving something to my family anymore. It was about sharing lessons that might help others navigate their own battles, whether in uniform or not. That evening, I pulled out my service journal, a habit I'd maintained throughout my military career. As I flipped through years of entries documenting challenges overcome and lessons learned, I realized how much wisdom I'd accumulated that had nothing to do with combat tactics. This invitation marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where my experience could inspire others beyond the military. For the first time since the graduation, I felt a sense of purpose returning. The dean had unknowingly offered me not just a speaking engagement, but a mission, a way to serve that didn't require a uniform, but still honored everything it represented. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope, my father's blocky handwriting instantly recognizable, despite the years that had passed since I'd last received anything from him. I sat on my apartment balcony, turning it over in my hands several times before finding the courage to open it. Dear Colonel Hayes, it began formally, as if addressing a stranger rather than his daughter. The formality stung, but I read on. His words were halting at first, then gained momentum as he confessed something that left me breathless. While he had maintained a stoic silence at home about my military achievements, he had been quietly collecting newspaper clippings, printed emails, and photographs of my deployments and ceremonies. I keep them in my desk drawer at work, he wrote. The guys at the office know all about you. They ask for updates whenever I mention you've been deployed somewhere new. My father, the man who could barely look at me during my brother's graduation, had apparently been showing my photos to his colleagues for years. He described how he would point out my medals, explaining their significance with a precision that surprised me. He knew the details of operations I thought he'd never bothered to learn about. I've never been good with words, he continued, his handwriting growing shakier. Your mother always handled the emotional stuff, but I want you to know I've always been proud. Maybe too proud. It scared me sometimes, how much you accomplished. I set the letter down, wiping unexpected tears from my cheeks. The revelation was like discovering a secret room in a house I thought I knew completely. All those years of perceived indifference masked something else entirely. A father who didn't know how to express his pride directly, so he channeled it elsewhere. He ended the letter with a clumsy invitation to call him sometime, adding that he had recently retired and was figuring out what to do with myself now. The vulnerability in those words was unlike anything I'd ever associated with my father. That night, I stared at old family photos, seeing them through new eyes. In one, my father stood slightly apart from the group, but his gaze was fixed on me in my first uniform. I had always interpreted his distance as disappointment. Now I wondered if it had been something else, perhaps awe or even intimidation. The bittersweet realization settled over me like a familiar weight. My father's respect had always been there, hidden beneath layers of silence and awkwardness. His pride in me had become part of his own identity at work, even as he struggled to express it at home. The letter didn't erase years of feeling invisible, but it offered something I hadn't expected, a bridge, however fragile, back to family. The buzz from the local newspaper spread faster than I anticipated. Within weeks, my smartphone was constantly lighting up with emails and calls. High schools wanted me to speak at assemblies. Veterans groups invited me to fundraisers. Business forums requested keynotes on leadership under pressure. Each invitation felt like validation, proof that my 20 years of service mattered beyond the battlefield. "You've become quite the celebrity," my father remarked during one of our rare phone conversations, his tone hovering between pride and concern. I accepted most invitations, finding purpose in sharing my experiences. Standing before auditoriums filled with teenagers, I spoke about discipline and perseverance. At veterans gatherings, I addressed the challenges of reintegration. The business community seemed particularly interested in my perspectives on leadership and crisis management. But with each new speaking engagement came a fresh wave of tension at home. My mother called one evening after seeing my name in the paper again. "Must you keep doing this?" she asked, her voice tight with disapproval. "Your brother is trying to establish himself in his career, and all anyone wants to talk about is you." "I'm not trying to overshadow him," I replied, gripping my cell phone tighter. "Well, that's exactly what's happening," she countered. "Every family gathering, someone mentions your speeches or that ceremony. It's like his graduation never happened." These conversations left me drained. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling of my apartment, wondering if I was wrong to accept the recognition I'd craved for so long. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of feeling invisible to my family, I was now apparently too visible. The emotional toll manifested physically. Dark circles formed under my eyes. I lost weight. The discipline that had carried me through military service now helped me maintain a packed speaking schedule despite exhaustion. One evening, after addressing a room full of business leaders, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "My daughter just enlisted," she said. "Hearing your story gives me hope for her future." Moments like these became my compass. Despite my mother's accusations and my own fatigue, I understood that my story wasn't just about seeking validation. It had become something larger, a bridge between military and civilian worlds, a source of inspiration for others navigating their own battles. I started setting boundaries, becoming more selective with invitations, and carving out time for rest. This wasn't another military campaign to be won through sheer endurance. It was a marathon that required balance, something I was only beginning to learn. The leadership forum at the university drew a modest crowd, mostly students, faculty, and a handful of local veterans curious about military leadership principles. I stood at the podium, my notes arranged neatly before me, when I noticed him in the third row, a young man in his early 20s, his posture unmistakably military, despite the casual campus attire. After my presentation, while others filed out toward the refreshment table, he approached with purpose. "Colonel Hayes," he said, extending his hand. "Private First Class Michael Donovan. Well, former private. Just Mike now." His handshake was firm, his eyes carrying the weight of experience beyond his years. Mike had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before pursuing his degree in business administration. As we found a quiet corner away from the mingling crowd, he confided that transitioning to civilian life had been harder than any deployment. "The structure disappears," he explained, fidgeting with the sleeve of his button-down shirt. "One day you're part of something bigger than yourself, and the next you're just nobody special in a classroom full of kids who've never missed a semester of school." I recognized that displacement in his words, the same alienation I'd felt standing outside those auditorium doors. While our circumstances differed, the core feeling of invisibility connected us across rank and generation. "The professors don't get it," Mike continued. "They talk about theoretical leadership while guys like us have actually led people when it mattered most." We exchanged phone numbers before parting ways. What began as casual check-ins evolved into regular coffee meetings at the campus cafe. I helped him navigate academic bureaucracy and translate his military experience into terms civilians could understand. He, in turn, kept me grounded in purpose when family tensions threatened to consume me. One evening, as we sat reviewing his resume, Mike looked up suddenly. You know, Colonel, seeing you stand up there at that forum, it changed things for me. How so? I asked, setting down my smartphone. Before, I thought maybe I'd made a mistake leaving service. But watching you build something new without losing who you are, it gave me hope that I can do the same. His words struck deeper than any commendation I'd received in 20 years of service. In mentoring this young veteran, I'd rediscovered parts of myself that had nothing to do with rank or family approval: compassion, patience, and the to listen without judgment. As we walked across campus that evening, I realized that perhaps my purpose had never been about forcing my family to see me. Perhaps it was about seeing others who, like Mike, needed someone to recognize their value in a world that often overlooked it. The leadership forum transformed into something unexpected as the day progressed. One by one, my brother's classmates approached me, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and admiration. A young woman with political science textbooks clutched against her chest introduced herself as my brother's study partner. Colonel Hayes, she said, her voice steady but reverent. Your perspective on crisis management was more valuable than 3 semesters of theory classes. I smiled, still uncomfortable with the attention, but warming to the genuine interest in their eyes. These students weren't offering hollow platitudes. They were hungry for something authentic, something beyond academic theories. A business major approached next, explaining how his professor had used military leadership models in class, but never with the human element I'd brought to my presentation. The way you describe making decisions when lives were at stake, it makes our case studies seem trivial, he admitted. What struck me most was how these young people, raised in the competitive atmosphere of academia, were suddenly valuing experiences that couldn't be quantified by grade point averages or scholarly publications. One senior confessed she'd always viewed military service as just following orders, until hearing my stories of ethical decision-making under pressure. The dean watched from across the room, nodding slightly as he witnessed the interactions. His gamble, bringing military experience into this ivory tower, was paying unexpected dividends. What had begun as a gesture of respect toward me was evolving into something more profound. Your brother never mentioned you were such a badass, one student said bluntly, then immediately apologized for his language. I laughed. He probably didn't know, I replied, realizing the truth in my words. My family had never really seen me in my element, commanding respect, not through force, but through earned authority. Faculty members lingered at the edges of these conversations, some looking uncomfortable, as students openly expressed how much they valued my real-world leadership over theoretical classroom discussions. The hierarchy was shifting before our eyes. What once had been academic elitism was giving way to genuine appreciation for service and sacrifice. A professor of international relations finally approached, extending his hand. I'd like to incorporate some of your experiences into my curriculum, he said, if you'd be willing. As the event concluded, I realized the dean's decision to honor me wasn't just changing my relationship with my family, it was transforming the culture of the university itself. The invisible wall between military and academic worlds had begun to crumble, one conversation at a time. The auditorium fell silent as I approached the podium. My hands trembled slightly, a rare sensation for someone who had commanded troops in combat zones. The dean introduced me with a warmth that still felt unfamiliar after years of military formality. I took a deep breath and began speaking, not from my prepared notes, but from the raw truth of my experiences. Leadership isn't about rank, I said. It's about standing tall when you've been knocked down and extending your hand to others even when yours is still bleeding. The speech flowed from me like a river breaking through a dam. Stories of battlefield decisions, of soldiers who taught me courage, of returning home to find myself a stranger in familiar places. I spoke about the graduation day, transforming my humiliation into a lesson about resilience. When I finished, the silence lingered for 3 heartbeats before erupting into applause. What happened next was entirely unexpected. A university staff member approached me afterward, mentioning they had recorded the forum for their archives. "Would you mind if we shared it online?" they asked. I nodded, thinking little of it. 4 days later, my smartphone wouldn't stop buzzing. The video had been viewed over 200,000 times. Comments flooded in from veterans, students, and civilians alike. Colonel Hayes spoke the words I've been trying to find for 20 years. Finally, someone understands what coming home really feels like. I'm showing this to my daughter who's struggling in college. Everyone needs to hear this. Emails arrive from news outlets requesting interviews. Veterans organizations asked me to speak at their events. A publishing company inquired about memoir rights. The dean called, his voice animated with excitement about what this meant for the university's veteran outreach efforts. For the first time, I wasn't being recognized for my uniform or rank, but for the human beneath them. The vulnerability I had shown, something the military had taught me to conceal, resonated more powerfully than any command I had ever given. My father sent a text message that simply read, "Proud of you." My mother called, her voice softer than I'd heard in years. Even my brother shared the video on his social media with the caption, "My sister, the Colonel." As I sat in my hotel room that night, scrolling through thousands of comments from strangers who suddenly felt like family, I realized something profound. The military had taught me how to lead others through chaos, but this experience was teaching me how to lead myself through healing. The uniform had given me structure, but removing it had given me a voice that carried far beyond any battlefield. My brother's text message came unexpectedly on a Tuesday morning, asking if I'd meet him for lunch. We hadn't spoken properly since his graduation 4 months earlier. I agreed, choosing a quiet cafe near the university where we wouldn't be interrupted. He was already waiting when I arrived, nervously tapping his fingers against a coffee mug. The tension between us was palpable as I slid into the booth across from him. Neither of us spoke immediately, both searching for the right words to bridge the chasm that had grown between us over the years. "I saw your speech online," he finally said, his voice softer than I remembered. "Everyone's talking about it." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. The waitress brought my coffee, providing a momentary distraction from the weight of unspoken words. "I've felt overshadowed by you my entire life," he admitted, meeting my eyes directly. Colonel Hayes, the decorated officer, the family hero. His hands tightened around his mug. "My graduation was supposed to be my moment, you know. The one day that wasn't about your achievements." The honesty stung, but I recognized the courage it took for him to voice these feelings. For the first time, I saw him not as my younger brother, but as a man with his own struggles and ambitions. "I never meant to cast a shadow," I replied carefully. "The military was my path, not a competition." He smiled ruefully. "I know that now. Watching how you've used your platform, how you've helped that student veteran and others, I finally get it." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "You didn't choose recognition. You earned it through service." We talked for hours, peeling back layers of misunderstanding and jealousy that had accumulated since childhood. He confessed to deliberately excluding me from the guest list, and I admitted how deeply that had hurt. Yet, instead of reopening wounds, our honesty began to heal them. Remember when we built that tree house? He asked suddenly, laughing at the memory. You designed the whole thing like it was a military operation. I smiled, recalling how he'd insisted on painting it bright blue against my practical suggestions. And you made it beautiful. As afternoon faded into evening, our sibling rivalry transformed into something resembling mutual respect. We weren't just brother and sister anymore, but two adults acknowledging each other's separate journeys and strengths. When we finally parted, he hugged me, not the awkward, obligatory embrace of recent years, but something genuine. I'm proud to be your brother, he whispered. Walking to my vehicle afterward, I felt lighter than I had in years. Some battles aren't won with strategy or strength, but with vulnerability and time. The student veteran's story had lit a fire in me. His struggles mirrored what so many faced: the jarring transition from military precision to academic uncertainty. 3 weeks after our first meeting, I drafted a proposal for a campus-wide veterans mentorship program. My military planning skills finally serving a purpose beyond battlefield strategy. This won't be easy to implement, the dean warned during our first official meeting. His support was clear, but his eyes betrayed concern about institutional resistance. He wasn't wrong. The administrative labyrinth proved more complex than any tactical operation I'd overseen in my 20 years of service. Faculty meetings became my new front line. Some professors viewed military experience as irrelevant to academic success, their skepticism evident in crossed arms and thinly veiled sighs. We already have counseling services, one department head argued, missing the point entirely about peer connection and shared experience. Funding presented another obstacle. I spent countless evenings at my laptop, crafting grant proposals until my eyes burned. My smartphone became command central, constantly buzzing with emails, calls from potential donors, and texts from student veterans eager to participate. The kitchen table in my temporary apartment transformed into headquarters, covered with spreadsheets and coffee-stained notes. My father surprised me by offering to connect me with his business associates. They respect what you've done, he said during a rare phone call, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of pride. This olive branch meant more than the subsequent donations his contacts provided. The program slowly took shape. We secured a small office space in the Student Union building. Nothing fancy, just enough room for a desk, 3 chairs, and a coffee maker that became the heart of our operation. Each small victory felt monumental. Our first official university email address, a modest budget approval, the faculty senate's grudging endorsement. What sustained me through the bureaucratic battles were the veterans themselves. A Marine who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan now struggled with statistics homework. An Air Force technician who could repair complex aircraft systems froze during class presentations. Their resilience in facing these new challenges humbled me. Some nights, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm my resolve. I'd catch myself staring at the ceiling at 3 in the morning, questioning whether this effort was worth the toll it was taking. But then I'd remember the look on that first student veteran's face when he realized he wasn't alone, and I'd find the strength to continue. The discipline that had carried me through military service now served a different purpose. This wasn't about following orders, but creating something new, a bridge between two worlds that rarely understood each other. With each small step forward, the program became my new mission, one that blended military discipline with something I hadn't realized I possessed in such measure: compassion. The mentorship program blossomed across campus like wildflowers after spring rain. What began as a small initiative with just 5 student veterans soon expanded to include over 30 participants meeting weekly in the university's East Wing. As program founder, I watched with quiet satisfaction as the culture shifted beneath our feet. Professor Daniels, who had once dismissed military experience as irrelevant to academic pursuits, now invited veterans to speak in his political science classes. These students bring perspectives we desperately need, he told me during a faculty mixer. The admission clearly difficult for him, but genuine nonetheless. The campus newspaper ran a three-part series on veteran students, highlighting their unique challenges and contributions. In the student union, conversations about service and sacrifice replaced the previous awkward silences whenever military experience was mentioned. Even the fraternity houses, once bastions of privilege, began hosting fundraisers for veteran scholarships. Local businesses joined the movement. The coffee shop near campus offered free drinks to program participants, while 3 downtown restaurants provided catering for our monthly leadership workshops. Alumni who had served in various branches reached out with donations and mentorship opportunities. A local car dealership even donated a vehicle to help transport veterans to medical appointments and job interviews. The transformation wasn't just in resources, but in respect. Students who once walked past veterans without acknowledgement now stopped to engage, to listen, to learn. The university that had once relegated military service to a footnote in diversity discussions now featured it prominently in recruitment materials and campus tours. Through it all, my family observed from a distance. My mother, who had once hushed me at my brother's graduation, called occasionally to ask about the program's progress, her voice carrying a new note of interest. My father forwarded articles about veteran initiatives at other universities. Even my sister-in-law, who had mocked my military stiffness, sent a brief text after seeing the program featured on local news. My brother remained the most transformed. He visited campus twice that semester, sitting quietly in the back during workshops, watching me guide discussions with the same authority I'd once commanded in uniform. "I never understood what you did before," he admitted over dinner one evening. "I just saw the medals, not the person who earned them." The skepticism that had once defined my family's view of my service gradually gave way to something I'd never expected: pride. Not the reluctant acknowledgement of duty, but genuine appreciation for the bridge I was building between two worlds they had never fully understood: military discipline and academic freedom, service and scholarship, sacrifice and success. The spring air carried a sense of déjà vu as I approached the same auditorium where, exactly 1 year ago, I had stood outside, uninvited and invisible. Today, however, the Veterans Mentorship Program banner hung proudly across the entrance, and students in uniform mingled with professors and administrators on the lawn. Inside, I scanned the crowd, my breath catching when I spotted them. My mother, father, and brother sat in the front row, no longer hiding in the shadows of shame or resentment. My sister-in-law sat beside them, her usual smirk replaced by something that almost resembled respect. They had arrived early to secure those seats, a small gesture that spoke volumes. The dean approached the podium, his voice carrying through the packed auditorium. 1 year ago, this campus witnessed something extraordinary. Not just a graduation, but the beginning of a transformation. His eyes found mine in the crowd. Colonel Hayes showed us that true leadership isn't about rank or recognition, but about resilience in the face of rejection. I felt my father shift in his seat, his shoulders straightening almost imperceptibly. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, while my brother nodded slowly, his gaze steady and clear. "Please welcome Colonel Hayes to the stage," the dean announced, gesturing toward me with an outstretched hand. As I rose from my seat, the applause began, tentative at first, then building to a thunderous roar. I walked the same path I had walked 1 year ago, but this time there was no confusion, no humiliation. Each step felt like reclaiming something precious that had been lost. The dean presented me with a crystal award, its weight substantial in my hands, for extraordinary service to our university community and for building bridges between military and academic worlds, he read from the inscription. I glanced down at my family, expecting the familiar wall of emotional distance. Instead, I watched as my father stood first, his weathered hands coming together in deliberate applause. My mother followed, then my brother, and finally, even my sister-in-law. Within moments, the entire auditorium was on its feet. The standing ovation washed over me like a cleansing rain. In their faces, my family's faces, I saw something I had craved for 20 years. Not just acceptance, but pride. Real pride. "Thank you," I said into the microphone, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. "This isn't just my victory. It belongs to every veteran who's ever felt invisible, and to every family learning to see them again." As I stood on the stage, the thunderous applause washed over me like a wave. For the first time since that fateful graduation day 1 year ago, I saw genuine pride in my mother's eyes as she clapped with enthusiasm rather than obligation. My father, usually so stoic, had tears streaming down his weathered face. Even my brother, who once feared being overshadowed, was beaming with admiration. The dean stepped forward, his voice carrying across the packed auditorium. "Colonel Hayes has transformed not just our campus, but our understanding of service and sacrifice," he announced, his hand resting supportively on my shoulder. I scanned the crowd, spotting my former mentee among dozens of student veterans whose lives had been touched by our program. Their faces reflected a confidence that hadn't been there months before. The young man who had first approached me at the leadership forum now stood tall, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. My sister-in-law, once so dismissive, now sat with her hands clasped tightly together, her earlier mockery replaced by what appeared to be genuine respect. The journey from exclusion to this moment of acceptance had been arduous, but transformative. "Thank you," I said simply, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. "This program isn't about me. It's about creating space for every veteran who walks onto this campus feeling invisible." The words resonated through the hall, and I caught glimpses of nodding heads and knowing glances among faculty members who had initially resisted the mentorship initiative. What had begun as my personal mission had evolved into a community-wide commitment. After the ceremony, my brother approached me, embracing me with a warmth I hadn't felt since childhood. "I'm sorry it took me so long," he whispered. My mother squeezed my hand as we walked toward the reception. "We always loved you," she said softly. "We just didn't know how to show it." That evening, surrounded by family, colleagues, and students, I realized that true recognition isn't found in medals or ceremonies. It's earned in quiet moments of perseverance when no one is watching. It's built in the consistent choice to serve others, even when that service goes unacknowledged. As the sun set over the campus, casting long shadows across the same steps where I had once sat alone, I felt a profound sense of homecoming. Not to a physical place, but to a state of belonging I had sought my entire life. The uniform, the medals, the rank, none of it mattered as much as this: being seen, truly seen, by those whose opinion I valued most. I had finally come home,